They say George Washington could not tell a lie. They say he had wooden teeth. They say he threw a silver dollar across the Potomac River. But here's the truth, almost none of that is real. The cherry tree story? Made up by his biographer. The wooden teeth? He had dentures made of ivory, lead, and even human teeth, but never wood. The silver dollar? That coin didn't exist when he was young. For over 2 centuries, Americans have wrapped George Washington in so many myths that we've forgotten the actual man underneath. And that's a problem, because the real George Washington is far more interesting, far more flawed, and far more human than the marble statue we've built in our minds. This is the story of how a young Virginia planter became the father of a nation, not through perfection, but through perseverance, principle, and an almost supernatural ability to walk away from power when everyone expected him to seize it. George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, into a world of tobacco plantations and colonial ambition. His family was part of Virginia's planter class, comfortable but not wealthy by the standards of the great Tidewater dynasties. His father, Augustine Washington, was a tobacco planter and iron manufacturer who owned several properties and about 50 enslaved people. His mother, Mary Ball Washington, was Augustine's second wife, a strong-willed woman who would live until George was 57 and whose relationship with her son remained complicated throughout her life. When George was 11 years old, his father died, and this loss would shape the trajectory of his entire life. Unlike his older half-brothers who had been educated in England, George would receive only the equivalent of an elementary school education. He never attended college, never traveled to Europe, and would remain self-conscious about his lack of formal education for the rest of his life. The death of his father meant that George did not inherit the bulk of the family estate. That went to his older half-brother Lawrence, who had married into the wealthy Fairfax family. Lawrence became something of a father figure to young George, introducing him to the powerful Fairfax clan and to a world of opportunity beyond the modest farm George had inherited. It was through Lawrence that George met Lord Fairfax, one of the largest landowners in Virginia, who controlled over 5 million acres in the Northern Neck and Shenandoah Valley. This connection would prove decisive. At age 16, Washington joined a surveying party that crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains into the Shenandoah Valley, land owned by the Fairfaxes. It was brutal work, sleeping in the open, dealing with rattlesnakes and hostile weather, encountering Native Americans who still controlled much of the territory. But it paid well, and more importantly, it taught Washington about land, about the frontier, and about the possibilities that lay in the Western territories. Within a year, he had been appointed official surveyor for Culpeper County. He was 17 years old and already making more money than most Virginia gentlemen. Washington spent the next 3 years surveying the Virginia wilderness, accumulating both money and knowledge of the frontier that would serve him for decades to come. By the time he was 20, he had purchased nearly 1,500 acres of Shenandoah Valley land. He was building wealth, but he was also building something else. A reputation for competence, for getting difficult jobs done, for being someone who could be trusted with responsibility. Washington's character was forged through a combination of self-education and social ambition. As a teenager, he famously copied out by hand the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation, a collection of 110 maxims about proper conduct. These weren't just abstract principles. They were a roadmap for a young man without inherited status trying to make his way in Virginia's hierarchical society. Rules like every action done in company ought to be with some sign of respect to those that are present, and use no reproachful language against anyone. Neither curse nor revile became the foundation of Washington's legendary self-control. He was constructing a public persona, teaching himself how to move in elite circles, how to command respect despite his modest background. But Washington's education went beyond manners. He was an obsessive reader of military history, consuming accounts of ancient and modern warfare. He studied mathematics and geometry for surveying. He taught himself enough law to manage his properties and handle contracts. What he lacked in formal schooling, He made up for in directed self-improvement and an almost ruthless focus on practical knowledge. In 1751, when Washington was 19, his brother Lawrence fell ill with tuberculosis. The family decided that a voyage to a warmer climate might help, and George accompanied Lawrence to Barbados, the only time Washington would ever leave the North American continent. It was during this trip that Washington contracted smallpox, a nearly fatal disease that left his face scarred, but crucially, gave him immunity to the illness that would kill thousands during the Revolutionary War. When they returned to Virginia, Lawrence's condition worsened, and he died in the summer of 1752. George was 20 years old, and the loss of his mentor and half-brother was devastating. But it also opened a door. Lawrence had held the position of Adjutant General for Virginia, a military position with significant prestige and a salary of £100 a year. The colony was divided into 4 military districts, and Washington, with almost no military experience, applied for one of these positions. Through a combination of Fairfax family connections and his own growing reputation, he was appointed adjutant for the Southern District of Virginia in early 1753, with the rank of major. He was 21 years old. Then, just months later, the adjutant for the Northern District died, and Washington successfully lobbied for that position instead, which paid twice as much and covered the frontier territories where tensions with France were rapidly escalating. Washington was positioning himself exactly where the action would be. In October 1753, Virginia's Lieutenant Governor Robert Dinwiddie called on Washington for a mission that would thrust him onto the world stage. The French had been building a line of forts from Lake Erie down through the Ohio Valley, territory that Virginia claimed for itself. Dinwiddie needed someone to deliver an ultimatum to the French commander: leave British territory or face military action. He needed someone who knew the frontier, who could handle the physical hardships of a winter journey through hundreds of miles of wilderness, and who was expendable enough that his potential death wouldn't cause a major diplomatic incident. Washington volunteered immediately. The mission was extraordinary in its difficulty. Washington and his small party traveled over 500 miles through snow and freezing rain, navigating rivers, dealing with hostile weather, and relying on the uncertain cooperation of Native American tribes caught between French and British imperial ambitions. At one point, Washington and his guide were shot at by a French allied Indian at close range. Later, crossing an ice-choked river on a makeshift raft, Washington was thrown into the freezing water and nearly drowned. But he completed the mission, delivered the message, and returned with the French commander's response. The French had no intention of leaving. Washington's official journal of the journey was published and circulated throughout the colonies and in London, making the 21-year-old surveyor famous overnight as a frontier hero. The response to French refusal was military action. In the spring of 1754, Virginia raised a militia regiment, and Washington, now promoted to lieutenant colonel, was sent back to the Ohio country with a small force to reinforce British positions. What happened next was a disaster that would help ignite a world war. On May 28, 1754, Washington's forces encountered a small French detachment. In the brief skirmish that followed, 10 Frenchmen were killed, including their commander, Jumonville, and 21 were captured. The exact circumstances of the battle remained controversial. The French claimed it was an unprovoked ambush and an assassination, while Washington maintained it was a legitimate military engagement. Regardless, Washington had just fired some of the first shots of what would become the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War. Washington's small force quickly constructed a crude fortification they called Fort Necessity. Within weeks, a much larger French and Indian force arrived to avenge Jumonville. On July 3, 1754, in pouring rain, Washington's outnumbered garrison was surrounded and bombarded. After a day of fighting, with a quarter of his men dead or wounded, Washington was forced to surrender. The French allowed the Virginians to withdraw, but Washington had to sign surrender terms that included an admission that he had assassinated Jumonville, a diplomatic catastrophe, when the document was translated and published. Washington had learned brutal lessons about the fog of war, about the need for adequate intelligence and supply lines, about the gap between his military ambitions and his actual experience. But rather than retreating from military service, he doubled down, convinced that with proper training and resources, he could succeed where he had failed. Washington's experience in the French and Indian War was marked by frustration with the British military establishment. After the Fort Necessity disaster, he resigned his commission rather than accept a demotion when Virginia's militia was reorganized under British regular officers. But the next year, he joined British General Edward Braddock's expedition to capture Fort Duquesne as a volunteer aide-de-camp. It was during this campaign that Washington experienced both the glory and the humiliation that would shape his revolutionary mindset. Braddock's force of nearly 1,500 British regulars and colonial militia marched confidently toward Fort Duquesne in July 1755. Washington, suffering from dysentery, had to be carried on a wagon. But when French and Indian forces ambushed the British column in the dense forest, the result was catastrophic. The British regulars, trained for European battlefield formations, were devastated by an enemy they couldn't see fighting from behind trees. Braddock was mortally wounded, and the British forces broke and ran. Washington, despite his illness, had 4 bullets pass through his coat and had 2 horses shot out from under him, but emerged unscathed. He helped organize the retreat and earned widespread praise for his courage under fire. But the experience left him bitter. British officers had dismissed colonial militia as inferior, had refused to adapt their tactics to frontier warfare, and had paid a terrible price for their arrogance. Over the next 3 years, Washington commanded Virginia's frontier defenses with the rank of colonel, trying to protect hundreds of miles of settlements with fewer than 1,000 men. It was thankless work, marked by constant funding shortages, discipline problems, and the horror of frontier warfare, where raids could wipe out entire families. Washington repeatedly traveled to Williamsburg to lobby for more resources, and just as often was ignored or dismissed by British authorities. He grew increasingly resentful of the British military system, which treated colonial officers as inferior regardless of their experience or competence. Washington had commanded hundreds of men in combat, yet any British officer with a royal commission automatically outranked him. In 1758, Washington participated in a second expedition against Fort Duquesne, this time successful, and afterward resigned his military commission. He was 26 years old and done with military service, or so he thought. He returned to Virginia, married Martha Dandridge Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children and an estate that made Washington one of the richest men in Virginia, and settled into the life of a plantation owner at Mount Vernon. For the next 15 years, Washington lived as a prosperous Virginia gentleman. He expanded Mount Vernon from a modest farmhouse into a grand estate, managed thousands of acres and over 100 enslaved people, experimented with crop rotation and new agricultural techniques, and served in Virginia's House of Burgesses. But the seeds of revolution were being planted. The British government, deeply in debt from the 7 Years' War, began imposing new taxes on the colonies: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. Washington, like many colonial elites, initially reacted with moderation. He opposed the taxes but sought legal, peaceful means of resistance. But as British policies grew more aggressive and colonial resistance grew more organized, Washington's position hardened. The Coercive Acts of 1774, passed in response to the Boston Tea Party, were a turning point. These acts closed Boston Harbor and effectively ended Massachusetts self-government. To Washington and many other colonists, this was tyranny, a fundamental violation of the rights of British subjects. When Virginia's House of Burgesses was dissolved by the royal governor for supporting Massachusetts, Washington joined other Virginia leaders in calling for a Continental Congress to coordinate colonial resistance. In September 1774, Washington was elected as one of Virginia's delegates to the First Continental Congress. He attended in his old military uniform, one of the only delegates with significant military experience. When fighting broke out at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, the question was no longer whether to resist, but how to fight. When the Second Continental Congress convened in May 1775, the situation was desperate. Colonial militia had besieged British forces in Boston after the battles of Lexington and Concord, but there was no unified command, no coherent strategy, and no real army. Congress needed to create a Continental Army from scratch and find someone to lead it. The choice of commander was as much political as military. New England had provided most of the troops currently surrounding Boston, but Southern colonies, particularly Virginia, needed to be firmly committed to the cause. John Adams of Massachusetts recognized that appointing a Southern commander would bind the colonies together. He also recognized that George Washington was the obvious choice. Washington had more military experience than virtually any other American. His service in the French and Indian War was well known. He was wealthy, which meant he could be trusted not to use military power for personal enrichment. He was respected, dignified, and had the physical presence that inspired confidence. At 6 feet 2 inches in an era when the average man was several inches shorter, Washington literally stood out in any room. On June 15, 1775, Congress unanimously elected Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington accepted with genuine reluctance and refused any salary, asking only that Congress cover his expenses. In his acceptance speech, he told Congress that he did not think himself equal to the command, a statement of either genuine modesty or political shrewdness, probably both. He left immediately for Boston, arriving in early July to take command of an army that existed more in theory than in reality. What Washington found in Cambridge was chaos. There were perhaps 16,000 men in the camps around Boston, but they were militia, not soldiers. They elected their own officers, came and went as they pleased, and had no training in military discipline or large-scale operations. There were almost no supplies, no gunpowder, no uniforms, no standardized weapons. Officers and enlisted men mingled freely. Discipline was nearly non-existent, and the various colonial contingents often refused to cooperate with each other. Washington immediately set about creating a real army. He established clear chains of command, enforced military discipline with floggings and occasionally executions, organized the camps along military lines, and began training the troops in basic military drill. He was shocked by what he privately called the leveling spirit of New England soldiers who expected to be consulted on decisions and treated their officers as equals. Washington believed an effective army required hierarchy, discipline, and obedience, and he set about imposing these values on troops who had very different ideas about the nature of military service. The siege of Boston dragged on through 1775 and into 1776. Washington wanted to attack, but his officers convinced him the army wasn't ready and the British positions were too strong. The breakthrough came in March 1776, when Colonel Henry Knox arrived with artillery that had been captured at Fort Ticonderoga and dragged 300 miles through winter snow. Washington had the guns placed on Dorchester Heights overlooking Boston, and the British, recognizing their position was now untenable, evacuated the city by sea without a fight. It was a tremendous boost to American morale and to Washington's reputation. But far larger challenges lay ahead. After the British evacuated Boston, Washington correctly anticipated that they would strike at New York, the strategic center of the colonies. He marched the Continental Army south and began fortifying New York City and the surrounding area. It was a nearly impossible task. New York was surrounded by water, which gave the British Navy enormous advantages. The city was divided between patriots and loyalists, and Washington's army, despite months of training, was still largely made up of inexperienced militia with short-term enlistments. In late summer 1776, the British launched the largest amphibious assault in history to that point, landing over 30,000 troops on Long Island. The British commander, General William Howe, had more soldiers than Washington, better trained soldiers, naval superiority, and the resources of the British Empire behind him. The Battle of Long Island in August 1776 was a disaster for the Americans. British forces flanked Washington's positions and nearly trapped the entire Continental Army. Only a nighttime evacuation across the East River, covered by fog, saved Washington's army from destruction. Over the next several months, Washington was forced into a steady retreat. He abandoned New York City, then retreated through New Jersey, losing men to desertion, capture, and expiring enlistments. British forces pursued, but never quite closed the trap, in part because General Howe was cautious, and in part because of Washington's skill at extracting his army from danger. By December 1776, Washington's army had crossed into Pennsylvania with fewer than 3,000 effective troops. Enlistments were expiring at the end of the year. The Revolution appeared to be collapsing. Congress had fled Philadelphia. Many Americans were accepting British offers of pardon. Washington's own officers were demoralized. Thomas Paine captured the mood in his essay, The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. Washington needed a victory, something to restore morale, and prove that the Continental Army could still fight. He found his opportunity on the other side of the Delaware River. The iconic image of Washington crossing the Delaware has been reproduced so many times that it's become a cliché, but the reality of that Christmas night in 1776 was far more desperate and dramatic than any painting can capture. Washington had intelligence that a garrison of Hessian mercenaries, about 1,500 men, was stationed at Trenton, New Jersey. They were professional soldiers hired by the British from German princes, and they had earned a fearsome reputation. Washington's plan was audacious to the point of recklessness. Cross the ice-choked Delaware River on Christmas night, march 9 miles to Trenton, and launch a surprise attack at dawn. Everything about the plan was risky. The weather was terrible, with freezing rain and snow. The river was filled with ice floes. Many of Washington's men didn't have proper boots and wrapped rags around their feet. The crossing was supposed to be completed by midnight to allow the army to reach Trenton before dawn, but ice and weather delayed them for hours. Washington divided his forces into 3 columns that were supposed to cross at different points and converge on Trenton. But 2 of the 3 crossings failed completely due to the weather and ice. Only Washington's column, about 2,400 men, made it across. A less determined commander would have called off the attack. They were hours behind schedule. The element of surprise might be lost, and 2/3 of the attacking force hadn't made it across the river. But Washington knew his army was disintegrating. If he retreated now, without fighting, the revolution might be over. He ordered the march to continue. The Continental Army reached Trenton around 8 in the morning. The Hessians, despite warnings from Loyalists that an attack might be coming, were caught completely by surprise. The garrison had celebrated Christmas the night before, and in the confusion of the dawn assault, they couldn't organize an effective defense. Washington's forces attacked from 2 directions. Artillery was brought up, and within an hour and a half, the battle was over. The Hessians surrendered, with over 900 captured, while American casualties were minimal. 2 soldiers froze to death during the march, and 4 were wounded in the battle itself. The psychological impact was enormous. Washington had proven that the Continental Army could plan and execute a complex operation and defeat professional European soldiers. Recruitment picked up, deserters returned, and the cause that had seemed lost a week earlier was suddenly alive again. But Washington wasn't done. He knew the British would respond forcefully to the humiliation at Trenton, and rather than retreating back across the Delaware, he decided to stay in New Jersey and keep fighting. The days following the crossing of the Delaware were some of the most remarkable in Washington's military career. After capturing Trenton, Washington recrossed the Delaware with his prisoners, but then made the bold decision to cross back into New Jersey again with fresh troops whose enlistments were about to expire. He offered a bounty to any man who would stay for 6 more weeks, and enough agreed to give him a small army of about 5,000 men. British General Cornwallis assembled a force of about 8,000 men and marched toward Trenton to trap Washington. By January 2, 1777, Cornwallis had Washington's army pinned against the Delaware River. The British commander was so confident that he told his officers they would bag the fox in the morning and went to sleep. That night, Washington pulled off another brilliant maneuver. Leaving campfires burning and a small detachment to make noise, he marched his entire army around the British flank on a back road, heading not away from the enemy but toward Princeton, where a smaller British force was stationed. It was another night march in freezing weather, but this time Washington's army reached its target. The Battle of Princeton on January 3rd was a close-run thing. An advance guard of Americans ran into British troops, and the American militia began to break. Washington personally rode between the lines, rallying the troops within 30 yards of British musket fire, an act of either extraordinary courage or suicidal recklessness. The British line broke instead, and Washington's army captured Princeton, taking supplies and prisoners. When Cornwallis realized what had happened, he marched his army toward Princeton, but Washington had already moved on, taking his army into the hills of northern New Jersey. The British abandoned their outposts in New Jersey and retreated to New Brunswick and New York. In 10 days, Washington had transformed the war. The Trenton-Princeton campaign became a masterclass in audacity, speed, and psychological warfare. Washington had understood something crucial. He didn't need to destroy the British army. He just needed to keep his own army in the field and keep winning enough small victories to sustain American morale and convince Britain that conquest would be too costly. King George III himself reportedly said when he heard about Princeton, "I see we have not been told the truth. The Americans can fight." The campaign made Washington's reputation as a military commander. He had shown strategic vision, tactical skill, personal courage, and an ability to inspire men to extraordinary efforts. But the war was far from over, and Washington's greatest trial still lay ahead. The winter of 1777 to 1778 at Valley Forge has become synonymous with suffering and endurance, and with good reason. After a campaign season that included both defeats and victories, Washington brought the Continental Army into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, about 20 miles from Philadelphia, which the British had captured. What followed was one of the most miserable winters in the Army's history. The conditions were appalling. The Army lacked adequate food, clothing, and shelter. Many soldiers had no shoes and left bloody footprints in the snow. They lived in hastily constructed log huts that were cold, damp, and crowded. Supply lines had broken down, and Congress, which had fled Philadelphia, seemed unable or unwilling to provide adequate support. Soldiers survived on fire cake, a mixture of flour and water baked on stones, and often went days with no meat. Disease swept through the camp. Typhus, typhoid, dysentery, and pneumonia killed more men than British muskets had. Of the roughly 12,000 men who entered Valley Forge, about 2,000 died before spring, and thousands more deserted. Washington spent the winter fighting 2 wars, one against the British and one against the Continental Congress and the various state governments that failed to supply his army. His letters from this period are filled with barely controlled fury at the incompetence, corruption, and indifference that left his soldiers to suffer and die. Profiteers sold supplies meant for the army to civilians who could pay higher prices. State militias refused to coordinate with the Continental Army. Congress debated while men starved. Washington's leadership during this crisis was perhaps his finest hour. He shared the hardships of his men, living in a simple stone house rather than confiscating a comfortable mansion. He personally lobbied Congress and the states for supplies. He organized foraging parties to seize supplies from the surrounding countryside, walking a fine line between military necessity and alienating the civilian population. He held the army together through sheer force of will and presence. But Valley Forge wasn't just about suffering. It was also where the Continental Army was transformed into a professional fighting force. In February 1778, a Prussian military officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge. Steuben had volunteered to help the American cause, and Washington immediately put him to work training the troops. Steuben created a standardized training program, teaching the soldiers proper military drill, bayonet tactics, and battlefield maneuvers. He started with a model company of about 100 men, trained them intensively, and then had them train others. By spring, the Continental Army, emerging from Valley Forge, was a fundamentally different force from the one that had entered. They could maneuver on the battlefield, execute complex formations, and fight European-style battles on more equal terms with British regulars. The transformation at Valley Forge coincided with even more important news from Europe. From the beginning of the Revolution, American leaders had recognized that victory would likely require European support, and France was the obvious choice. France had lost the 7 Years' War to Britain and was eager for revenge. French military supplies had been flowing secretly to the Americans since 1776. But open French intervention required convincing the French government that America could actually win, and through 1776 and 1777, that seemed increasingly doubtful. Everything changed with the Battle of Saratoga in October 1777. While Washington was maneuvering around Philadelphia, a British army under General John Burgoyne had marched south from Canada, intending to split New England from the other colonies. American forces under General Horatio Gates surrounded and captured Burgoyne's entire army of over 6,000 men. It was the most significant American victory of the war and proved that the Continental Army could win major conventional battles. When news reached France, it broke the diplomatic logjam. In February 1778, France and the United States signed treaties of alliance and commerce. France recognized American independence, committed to fight until that independence was secured, and promised not to make a separate peace with Britain. For Britain, the American Rebellion had suddenly become a global war. French entry changed everything. Britain now had to defend its valuable Caribbean sugar islands, protect its interests in India, and guard against a potential invasion of the home islands. The Americans were no longer fighting alone. French money, supplies, and eventually troops and naval power would flow to America. Washington, who had spent 2.5 years fighting with inadequate resources, suddenly had a powerful ally. The French alliance also changed Washington's strategic calculations. With French naval power potentially able to challenge British control of American waters, combined operations became possible. But cooperation with the French would prove more complicated than Americans initially hoped. Cultural differences, conflicting priorities, and the challenge of coordinating operations across thousands of miles of ocean meant that effective Franco-American cooperation took years to achieve. Nevertheless, the psychological impact was immediate. The Continental Army that marched out of Valley Forge in June 1778 was better trained, better supplied, and newly confident that ultimate victory was possible. When British forces evacuated Philadelphia and marched toward New York, Washington's army pursued and fought them to a standstill at the Battle of Monmouth in June 1778, the longest single-day battle of the war. The Continental Army held the field and proved they could stand and fight against British regulars in open battle. The war dragged on for 3 more years after Valley Forge, with the main theater shifting to the southern colonies. British strategy focused on capturing southern ports and rallying Loyalist support, and they achieved significant success, capturing Savannah and Charleston and winning several battles in the Carolinas. Washington remained in the north, watching the main British army in New York and dealing with the constant challenges of keeping his army fed, supplied, and intact. But by 1781, circumstances aligned for a decisive campaign. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was sailing to the Chesapeake. A French army under Comte de Rochambeau was cooperating with Washington, and British General Cornwallis, after a campaign through the Carolinas, had moved his army to Yorktown, Virginia, a tobacco port on the York River, where he was fortifying positions and waiting for reinforcement or evacuation by the British Navy. Washington recognized the opportunity immediately. If the French fleet could control the Chesapeake Bay and prevent British naval reinforcement, and if American and French ground forces could move quickly enough, Cornwallis's army could be trapped. It was a massive logistical challenge. Washington's army was in the Hudson Valley. Rochambeau's French army was in Rhode Island. They needed to march over 400 miles to Virginia without alerting the British to their true intentions. Washington conducted an elaborate deception, making it appear that he was preparing to attack New York, while secretly planning the march south. In late August 1781, the combined Franco-American army, about 9,000 troops, began moving south. They crossed New Jersey, marched through Philadelphia, where cheering crowds lined the streets, and continued south through Maryland and into Virginia. Meanwhile, the French fleet arrived in the Chesapeake and, in the Battle of the Chesapeake Capes in early September, defeated a British fleet and established control of the bay. Cornwallis was now trapped. By late September, Washington had assembled a siege force of over 16,000 American and French troops surrounding Yorktown. Cornwallis had about 8,000 men and limited supplies. The siege followed 18th century conventions. Trenches were dug closer and closer to British positions. Artillery was brought up, and steady bombardment made the British position increasingly untenable. On the night of October 14th, American and French forces stormed two British redoubts in coordinated attacks. The American assault, led by Alexander Hamilton, captured its objective in less than 10 minutes with bayonets. The French took slightly longer, but were equally successful. The British position was now hopeless. On October 17, 1781, for years to the day after the British surrender at Saratoga, Cornwallis asked for terms. 2 days later, the British Army marched out and laid down their weapons, while their band reportedly played "The World Turned Upside Down." It was a humiliating defeat for Britain. An entire army lost, the second such loss of the war. Cornwallis himself didn't attend the surrender ceremony, claiming illness, and sent a subordinate in his place. Washington, in turn, refused to accept the sword from a subordinate and designated his own second-in-command to receive it. The formalities of 18th century military protocol were scrupulously observed, even in defeat. Yorktown didn't technically end the war. British forces still occupied New York, Charleston, and Savannah. But politically it was decisive. When news reached London, British public support for the war collapsed. The government fell, and negotiations for peace began. It would take nearly 2 more years to finalize the Treaty of Paris, but Yorktown was the effective end of fighting. Washington had achieved what many thought impossible. He had defeated the most powerful military in the world. The period between Yorktown and the final British evacuation was in some ways more dangerous for Washington than the war itself. He had an army of disgruntled soldiers who hadn't been paid regularly, who had suffered enormously, and who were increasingly angry at Congress's failure to honor its promises. In March 1783, a group of officers circulated anonymous letters calling for the Army to refuse to disband until Congress met their demands, and hinting at more dramatic action, possibly even a military coup. Washington confronted the crisis at a dramatic meeting in Newburgh, New York. He appeared before his officers and delivered a speech rejecting any notion of military intervention in civilian government. At one point, Washington pulled out a letter from Congress and fumbled with glasses he rarely wore in public, saying, "Gentlemen, you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." It was a brilliant piece of theater, reminding the officers of his own sacrifices and making the emotional case for patience and Republican virtue over military force. The officers were moved to tears, the conspiracy collapsed, and Washington's moral authority held the army together. The Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783, recognizing American independence. The last British troops evacuated New York on November 25, 1783, and Washington entered the city in triumph. But the most important moment came a few weeks later. On December 23, 1783, Washington appeared before Congress in Annapolis, Maryland, and formally resigned his commission as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. The symbolism was profound. Washington had wielded enormous power for 8.5 years. He commanded the loyalty of the Army. Many would have supported him if he had chosen to seize power, as military commanders had done throughout history and across the world. Instead, Washington surrendered his military authority to civilian government and returned to private life. King George III, when told that Washington intended to resign and return to his farm, reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington did exactly that. He went home to Mount Vernon, planning to spend the rest of his life as a farmer and private citizen. But the new nation he had helped create was already in crisis, and within a few years, his country would call on him again. The government established under the Articles of Confederation was proving inadequate to the challenges of independence. Congress had no power to tax, no power to regulate commerce, no executive branch to enforce laws, and no federal judiciary. States imposed tariffs on each other, printed their own money, and sometimes threatened armed conflict over territorial disputes. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786, where armed farmers rebelled against debt collection and tax policies, terrified many leaders who feared the revolution might descend into anarchy. By 1787, there was a growing consensus that the Articles needed to be revised, possibly replaced entirely. A convention was called to meet in Philadelphia in May 1787, and every state except Rhode Island sent delegates. Washington was chosen as a Virginia delegate, and when the convention opened, he was immediately and unanimously elected its president. The choice was both symbolic and practical. Washington's presence gave the convention legitimacy and gravitas. His reputation for integrity meant that whatever plan emerged would be taken seriously. And his leadership style, formal and dignified, but not overbearing, helped keep the fractious delegates focused on their work. Washington didn't play a major role in the debates. He spoke rarely from a floor, preferring to let other delegates like James Madison, James Wilson, and Gouverneur Morris argue the details of the new Constitution. But his influence was everywhere. He supported a strong national government with an independent executive, positions that shaped the final document. The question of the presidency was particularly fraught. Many delegates feared creating an executive position that might become a monarch in all but name. They were only willing to create a powerful presidency because they knew Washington would be the first president and trusted him not to abuse the office. Alexander Hamilton later wrote that the Constitution was made for Washington, and Washington for the Constitution. When the convention finished its work in September 1787, Washington signed the Constitution first, as president of the convention, and then worked behind the scenes to promote ratification. His support was crucial. Federalists cited Washington's endorsement when arguing for ratification, while anti-Federalists could hardly claim the Constitution would lead to tyranny when Washington himself supported it. By June 1788, 9 states had ratified the Constitution, the number required for it to take effect. The new government was scheduled to begin in 1789, and everyone knew who would be the first president. The Electoral College cast its votes in February 1789, and the result was unanimous. Every elector voted for George Washington. It was the only time in American history that a president would be elected unanimously, and it was repeated in 1792 when Washington was re-elected. Washington was sworn in as the first president of the United States on April 30, 1789, on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. Everything about Washington's presidency was precedent-setting because there were no precedents. How should the president be addressed? What role should he play in legislation? How should he interact with Congress? What should the executive branch look like? How powerful should the federal government be? Every decision Washington made would set a pattern for future presidents. Washington approached the presidency with his characteristic combination of dignity and practicality. He rejected proposals to address him as His Highness or His Excellency, settling on the simple Mr. President. He established a cabinet of department heads to advise him, appointing talented but often conflicting personalities. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox as Secretary of War, and Edmund Randolph as Attorney General. Washington held regular cabinet meetings, sought advice widely, but made clear that final decisions were his alone. He also established a practice of consulting the Senate on treaties and major appointments, while maintaining that the executive branch was independent and co-equal with Congress, not subordinate to it. Washington worked to elevate the dignity and power of the presidency without appearing monarchical, a delicate balance that he generally maintained successfully. Washington's presidency was marked by several crucial decisions that shaped the new nation. Perhaps the most important was his support for Alexander Hamilton's financial plan. The federal government had inherited massive debts from the Revolutionary War, and the states had their own debts. Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume all state debts, create a national bank, and establish federal taxes to pay off the debt and fund the government. The proposal was brilliant but controversial. Southern states like Virginia had already paid off much of their debt and didn't want to be taxed to pay off northern states' obligations. Jefferson and Madison opposed the bank as unconstitutional, arguing the Constitution didn't explicitly grant Congress the power to create a bank. The debate threatened to tear apart the fragile new government. Washington, after careful consideration, sided with Hamilton. He was convinced by Hamilton's argument for implied powers, that the Constitution granted Congress the power to do what was necessary and proper to execute its explicit powers, and a national bank was necessary to manage the nation's finances. In 1791, Washington signed the bill creating the Bank of the United States, establishing the precedent for a broad interpretation of federal power that would shape American constitutional law for centuries. Another crucial decision involved foreign policy. In 1793, war broke out between revolutionary France and Britain. The 1778 Franco-American Treaty was still technically in effect, and many Americans wanted to support France, which had helped them win independence. But Washington, with Hamilton's support, issued a proclamation of neutrality, declaring that the United States would remain neutral in the European conflict. This enraged Jefferson and others who supported France, but Washington recognized that the new nation was too weak to survive involvement in a European war. The Neutrality Proclamation established a pattern of American foreign policy, avoiding entangling alliances and European conflicts that would last for over a century. Washington also had to deal with domestic crises. In 1794, Western Pennsylvania farmers rebelled against Hamilton's excise tax on whiskey, attacking tax collectors and threatening armed resistance. The Whiskey Rebellion was a direct challenge to federal authority. Washington responded decisively, calling up militia from several states and personally leading an army of over 12,000 men to western Pennsylvania. The rebellion collapsed without significant fighting, but Washington had made the point. The federal government had the power and will to enforce its laws. For the first time, federal authority had been upheld by force, establishing that the United States was a government, not merely a league of states. Throughout his presidency, Washington tried to remain above partisan politics, but he couldn't prevent the emergence of the first American political party system. Hamilton's supporters coalesced into the Federalist Party, while Jefferson and Madison's supporters formed the Democratic-Republican Party. Washington was aligned with the Federalists on most issues, but tried to maintain that he was president of all Americans, not the leader of a faction. By his second term, he was increasingly frustrated with partisan attacks, particularly from the Democratic-Republican press, which accused him of monarchical ambitions and betraying revolutionary principles. The most important precedent Washington set was one of restraint. He voluntarily gave up power. As his second term neared its end in 1796, there was significant support for Washington to run for a third term. He was still the most popular and respected figure in American politics, and many feared the consequences of his departure. But Washington was 64 years old, exhausted by 8 years of presidency, and determined to return to Mount Vernon. More importantly, he believed that the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another was essential to proving that Republican government could work. In September 1796, Washington published his farewell address, one of the most important documents in American political history. The address was drafted with Hamilton's help but reflected Washington's own views and experience. Washington announced he would not seek a third term, making a 2-term limit an informal tradition that would last until Franklin Roosevelt and become constitutional law with the 22nd Amendment. The farewell address also offered advice that Washington hoped would guide the nation. He warned against the dangers of political parties, which he called factions, that would pursue their own interests over the national good. He warned against regional divisions that might tear the country apart. He urged Americans to cherish the Union above all else. And he offered foreign policy advice that would shape American thinking for generations. Avoid permanent alliances with foreign nations, maintain neutrality in European conflicts, and build the nation's strength through commerce and peace rather than military adventures. Washington left office in March 1797, attending the inauguration of his successor, John Adams, and then riding home to Mount Vernon. The peaceful transfer of power from Washington to Adams, from one president to another, established a precedent that has endured for over 2 centuries. It was a statement that in America, the office was more important than the individual, that power belonged to the people and was temporarily loaned to their elected representatives. Washington spent his final 2.5 years at Mount Vernon, managing his plantation and trying to extract himself from public affairs. He remained active, riding around his property daily, corresponding with friends and former colleagues, and planning improvements to his estate. On December 12, 1799, Washington spent hours riding around Mount Vernon in cold, wet weather. He developed a severe throat infection, probably acute epiglottitis, and despite the efforts of 3 physicians, his condition worsened. He died on the evening of December 14, 1799, at age 67, surrounded by friends and family. His last words were, "'Tis well." For all his virtues, Washington was a deeply flawed man, and understanding his flaws is essential to understanding the real person rather than the myth. Washington owned enslaved people throughout his adult life. At his death, there were 317 enslaved people at Mount Vernon, though Washington personally owned only about half of them. The rest belonged to the Custis estate through his marriage to Martha. Washington's relationship with slavery was complicated and evolved over time. As a young man, he accepted slavery, without question, as part of Virginia Plantation Society. He bought and sold enslaved people, used them as collateral for loans, and pursued runaways. But his views shifted during and after the Revolution. The contradiction between fighting for liberty while denying it to others was not lost on Washington, and he became increasingly uncomfortable with the institution. He stopped buying enslaved people in the 1770s, and in private letters expressed hope that slavery would be gradually abolished. But he did not free his slaves during his lifetime, except for one, William Lee, his personal servant during the war, whom Washington freed in his will and provided with a pension. Washington's will directed that the enslaved people he personally owned should be freed upon Martha's death, with provisions for the education of younger ones and pensions for the elderly. This was unusual for Virginia slaveholders, but fell far short of the moral leadership on slavery that might be expected from the father of the country. Martha freed Washington's slaves in 1801, a year after his death, possibly because she feared they might hasten her own death to secure their freedom. The enslaved people from the Custis estate, which Martha didn't have the authority to free, remained enslaved. Washington was also vain and sensitive to criticism in ways that contradicted his image of marble statue dignity. He obsessed over his reputation, carefully preserved his correspondence for posterity, and was genuinely hurt by partisan attacks during his presidency. He had a fierce temper that he learned to control, but sometimes erupted in private. He was extraordinarily ambitious, though he carefully cultivated an image of reluctant service. He was also, by the standards of his time, ruthless in warfare. During the Revolutionary War, he approved operations against Native American allies of Britain that destroyed villages and crops, leaving populations to starve. In the frontier warfare of his era, this was considered necessary military action, but it involved tremendous suffering by noncombatants. Another little-known aspect of Washington's life was his lifelong love of theater and entertainment, which contrasted with his stern public image. He attended plays regularly, enjoyed dancing, and was fond of fox hunting and card games. He was also deeply concerned with appearance and fashion, ordering expensive clothes from London and paying careful attention to his public presentation. His famous false teeth, made from ivory, lead, and human teeth, caused him constant pain and affected his speech and appearance, contributing to his sometimes stern expression in portraits. Washington's business dealings were sometimes ethically questionable by modern standards. He used his inside knowledge as a public official to speculate in Western lands. He was willing to bend rules when it suited him, such as when he quietly sold surplus army supplies to himself at favorable prices during the French and Indian War. These actions were not unusual for his time and wouldn't have been seen as corrupt by 18th century standards, but they complicate the image of perfect integrity. George Washington's legacy is impossible to overstate. He didn't create American democracy, but he made it possible. His leadership during the Revolutionary War kept the Continental Army in the field when lesser commanders would have given up or been destroyed. His restraint in victory established that military leaders would serve civilian authority. His presidency set precedents that shaped the office for centuries. And his voluntary surrender of power twice proved that Republican government could work in a world where most people believed it couldn't. Washington understood something profound about power, that the most important thing a leader can do is establish when and how to give it up. He could have been king, could have been president for life, could have used military force to impose his vision on the country. He chose instead to trust in the democratic process, to set limits on his own authority, and to return power to the people. That choice made everything else possible. The mythology that grew up around Washington, the stories of the cherry tree and superhuman virtue, obscured the real man, and in some ways that's a loss. The real Washington is more impressive than the myth because his achievements came despite his flaws, not because he was perfect. He was ambitious, but learned to channel that ambition toward public service. He was a slaveholder who recognized the immorality of slavery but lacked the courage to fully confront it. He craved respect and fame, but learned to subordinate those desires to duty. He made military and political mistakes, but learned from them and persevered. Washington's true genius was not in brilliance, though he was intelligent, nor in tactical innovation, though he could be bold when necessary. His genius was in understanding what the moment required. Steadiness when others panicked, boldness when others hesitated, restraint when others would have grasped for power. He had an almost uncanny sense of how to act to preserve his army, his reputation, and ultimately the Republican experiment itself. The United States might have won independence without Washington, though it would have been much harder and much less likely. But it's difficult to imagine the United States developing into a stable republic without his example. The peaceful transfer of power, the civilian control of the military, the two-term tradition, the elevation of the presidency without making it a monarchy. These weren't inevitable. They happened because Washington made them happen, through conscious choices to limit his own power and to trust in the system he had helped create. Washington died believing, as he wrote to Lafayette, that the establishment of our new government seemed to be the last great experiment for promoting human happiness. The experiment continues, imperfect and ongoing. The institutions Washington helped create have been tested, have evolved, have sometimes failed and been reformed. But they endure, and at their heart is still Washington's central insight. That legitimate power comes from the people, is temporarily granted to leaders, and must be regularly returned. In that sense, George Washington's greatest legacy isn't what he built, but what he walked away from. The father of the country became the father of the country precisely because he refused to be its king. That's the man behind the monument, the man behind the myth, flawed, ambitious, sometimes petty, and ultimately great not because he was perfect, but because when it mattered most, he made the right choice. He chose the republic over himself, and that made all the difference.